She was crying in the church after everyone left. The cowboy sat next to her until the sun rose. Tears splashed onto the worn wooden pew as Delilah Matthews clutched her mother's locket, the last remnant of a family now laid to rest in the dusty ground of Sweetwater Creek, Texas. The year was 1876, and at 22, she found herself utterly alone in a town that had once held all her dreams, but now harbored only ghosts. Delilah had managed to maintain her composure through the service, standing tall and dignified as the townspeople offered condolences for her mother's passing, the final victim of the fever that had already claimed her father and younger brother just months before. But now, in the emptiness of the small white church, with the last mourners long gone, and even Reverend Thompson retreated to his quarters, her grief erupted like a summer storm. Her sobs echoed against the simple wooden walls, mingling with the creaking of the building as it settled in the cooling evening air. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent, painting the stained glass windows with vibrant hues that once would have delighted her. Today, they merely cast colored shadows across her black morning dress. The sound of boots on the wooden floor startled her, and Delilah hastily tried to wipe away her tears. She hadn't realized anyone remained in the church. Turning slightly, she glimpsed a tall figure moving slowly down the aisle. The last person she expected or wanted to see. Vaughn Calloway, the town's most notorious cowboy. His reputation preceded him wherever he went in Sweetwater Creek. A man who'd ridden with some of the toughest outfits in Texas, who could outshoot and outride men half his age despite being only 30 himself. He wasn't an outlaw, not exactly, but the dangerous glint in his eyes and the way his hand never strayed far from his holster made most townspeople give him a wide berth. "Miss Matthews," he said, his voice unexpectedly gentle as he approached. "I didn't mean to intrude." Delilah straightened her back, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable state. "Mr. Calloway, I thought everyone had left." "Almost everyone," he replied, removing his hat to reveal dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "I wanted to pay my respects properly. Your mother was a kind woman." This surprised her. She hadn't known Vaughn had any connection to her mother. "You knew her?" A small smile touched his lips, softening the hard planes of his face. "She patched me up once, after a disagreement with some cattle rustlers turned ugly. Wouldn't take a penny for it, either. Just made me promise to stay out of trouble," as she put it. He mimicked her mother's gentle scolding tone with surprising accuracy. Despite herself, Delilah felt a fresh tear slide down her cheek. That sounded exactly like her mother, always helping others, never expecting anything in return. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Matthews," Vaughn said, his voice low. "Truly." She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She expected him to leave then, to tip his hat and walk away like all the others had done. Instead, he hesitated, then gestured to the empty space beside her. "Would you mind if I sat for a spell?" Delilah was too surprised to refuse. She simply nodded, shifting slightly to make room for him on the pew. He sat carefully, keeping a respectful distance between them, his hat held loosely in calloused hands. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, but Delilah felt acutely aware of his presence, the faint scent of leather and horses that clung to him, the way he seemed too large for the small church pew. "They say it gets easier," he finally offered, staring straight ahead at the simple wooden cross that hung above the altar. "The pain, I mean, that's what folks told me when my pa died. I was 14. Delilah glanced at him, surprised by this revelation. "Did it get easier?" He considered this, his brow furrowing slightly. "Not easier, exactly. Different. Less sharp around the edges, I suppose. More like a dull ache you learn to live with." "I'm not sure that's very comforting," she replied, though there was no bite to her words. "No," he agreed with a small, sad smile. "I reckon it's not." Another silence fell between them. broken only by the occasional sound of Delilah sniffling. She should have been scandalized by his presence. An unmarried woman alone with a man like Vaughn Calloway would set tongues wagging throughout Sweetwater Creek. But somehow, in her grief, such concerns seemed trivial. "What will you do now?" he asked after a while. It was the question Delilah had been avoiding since the doctor had confirmed her mother wouldn't recover. The family store had been sold months ago to pay for her father's and brother's medical expenses. The small house where she'd grown up would need to be vacated soon. It belonged to the mercantile owner who'd only allowed them to stay out of respect for her mother. "I don't know," she admitted, twisting the locket between her fingers. "My aunt in St. Louis has offered to take me in, but that's not what you want," Vaughn finished for her when she trailed off. "No," Delilah said softly. "This is my home. These mountains, this sky. I can't imagine living anywhere else. But I'm not sure I have a choice." Vaughn nodded, understanding in his eyes. "There's always a choice, Miss Matthews. Sometimes none of them are good, but there's always a choice." Outside, the sun continued its descent, the light in the church growing dimmer. Soon, darkness would fall completely, and propriety demanded that Delilah should rise, thank Mr. Calloway for his kindness, and return to what remained of her home. Instead, she found herself asking, "How did you do it? After your father died?" He seemed surprised by the question, his fingers tightening briefly around the brim of his hat. "I rode out," he said simply. "Joined a cattle drive heading north. Figure hard work would keep my mind off things. Did it. For a time." He shrugged. "Until nightfall, anyway. Can't outrun your thoughts when the world goes quiet." Delilah understood that all too well. The nights had been the hardest since her family began dying lying alone in her bed, listening to the oppressive silence where once there had been her father's deep laugh, her mother's soft humming, her brother's playful chatter. "I keep thinking I hear them," she confessed, barely above a whisper. "I'll be washing dishes and think I hear my mother calling my name, or I'll wake up expecting to smell my father's pipe tobacco." Vaughn nodded, his expression solemn. "I still look for my pa sometimes when I ride into town, half expecting to see him sitting outside the barber shop, whittling away at some piece of wood." "Does anyone else know this softer side of you, Mr. Calloway?" Delilah asked, surprising herself with the boldness of her question. His laugh was unexpected, a rich, warm sound that seemed to fill the empty church. "Not many, Miss Matthews. I find it's easier to keep people at a distance in my line of work." "And what exactly is your line of work?" "I've heard stories, but most are exaggerated," he said, though a smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I work for the Cattlemen's Association now, tracking rustlers mostly. Occasionally providing security for payroll shipments." "That sounds dangerous." "It can be," he admitted, "but I'm good at it." Outside, the last rays of the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, plunging the church into near darkness. Only the faint glow of the moon through the windows provided any illumination now. "I should go," Delilah said reluctantly, though the thought of returning to her empty house filled her with dread. Vaughn stood, offering her his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, feeling the rough calluses against her smoother skin as he helped her to her feet. "Allow me to escort you home, Miss Matthews," he said, releasing her hand once she was standing. "It wouldn't be proper for you to walk alone at this hour." Propriety seemed a strange concern coming from a man with his reputation, but Delilah found herself nodding gratefully. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." They walked in companionable silence through the small town, past darkened storefronts and houses where lamplight glowed in windows. A few people were still about, men leaving the saloon, a woman hurrying home with a basket of laundry, and Delilah noticed the curious glances thrown their way. By tomorrow, she knew, the gossip would be spreading like wildfire. Delilah Matthews, walking with Vaughn Calloway in the dark of night. Strangely, she found she didn't care. At her front gate, they paused. The small house looked dark and uninviting, a reminder of all she had lost. "Thank you for walking me home," she said, turning to face him. In the moonlight, his features were softened, the dangerous edge that usually surrounded him muted. "It was my pleasure, Miss Matthews," he replied, placing his hat back on his head. He hesitated, then added, "If you need anything at all, you can find me at the Broken Spoke most evenings." The offer surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have after the kindness he'd shown her tonight. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway. I appreciate that." He nodded once, then stepped back, waiting as she unlatched her gate and walked the short path to her front door. Only when she was safely inside did she hear the sound of his boots on the packed dirt road, moving away. Delilah lit a lamp and moved through the quiet house, her mind replaying their conversation. Of all the people in Sweetwater Creek, Vaughn Calloway was the last person she would have expected to offer comfort on this, the darkest day of her life. Yet his presence had been strangely soothing, his understanding of her grief more genuine than the platitudes offered by neighbors and friends. As she prepared for bed, removing her black dress and carefully hanging it up, Delilah found herself wondering about the man behind the fearsome reputation. There was more to Vaughn Calloway than the town whispered about, that much was clear. What else lay beneath that carefully guarded exterior? For the first time since her mother had fallen ill, Delilah's thoughts before sleep weren't solely consumed by grief. Instead, she found herself pondering the unexpected kindness of a cowboy with sad eyes and gentle hands, who had sat with her in an empty church until the sun went down. The following days passed in a blur of practicalities. There was the house to empty, possessions to sort through, decisions to make about what to keep and what to sell. Neighbors helped when they could, bringing food and offering assistance with the heavier tasks, but largely, Delilah worked alone. She didn't see Vaughn Calloway during this time, though she found herself looking for him whenever she ventured into town. Once or twice, she glimpsed his tall figure from a distance, standing outside the telegraph office or emerging from the general store, but their paths didn't cross directly. A week after the funeral, Delilah received a letter from her aunt in St. Louis, urging her to come east as soon as possible. "There is nothing left for you in that wild country," her aunt wrote. "Here, you will have family, security, and the chance to make a suitable match." The letter left Delilah feeling hollow. Her aunt meant well, but the thought of leaving Sweetwater Creek, of abandoning the land where her family was buried, felt like another death. Yet what choice did she have? Her savings were meager, certainly not enough to establish herself independently. That evening, desperate for escape from her thoughts, Delilah found herself walking toward the Broken Spoke. It wasn't a respectable establishment for a young woman to visit alone, particularly not one in mourning, but she remembered Vaughn's words. "If you need anything, you can find me at the Broken Spoke most evenings." She didn't go inside, of course. Instead, she hovered across the street, wondering what had possessed her to come here. Just as she was about to turn away, the saloon doors swung open, and Vaughn emerged, lighting a cigarette as he stepped onto the boardwalk. For a moment, he didn't notice her, gazing up at the star-filled sky as he exhaled a stream of smoke. Then his eyes fell on her slender figure in the shadows, and he went very still. "Miss Matthews," he called, extinguishing his cigarette immediately. Delilah stepped forward, suddenly aware of how improper her behavior was. "Mr. Calloway, I'm sorry to disturb you." He crossed the street quickly, concern evident in his expression. "Are you all right? Has something happened?" "No, nothing like that," she assured him. I remembered what you said about finding you here, and She trailed off, uncertain how to explain her presence without sounding desperate or foolish. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You needed someone to talk to." Relief washed over her. "Yes." He glanced back at the saloon, then down the quiet street. "This isn't the place for a lady like yourself. Would you allow me to walk with you for a while instead?" Delilah nodded gratefully, and they fell into step together, heading toward the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open prairie. The night was warm, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. "I received a letter from my aunt today," Delilah said after they had walked in silence for several minutes. "She wants me to come to St. Louis." Vaughn absorbed this information, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "And is that what you want?" "No," she admitted, "but I'm not sure what else to do. The house must be vacated by the end of the month, and my prospects here are limited." They had reached the outskirts of town now, where a lone cottonwood tree stood sentinel over the rolling grassland beyond. Vaughn stopped beneath its spreading branches, turning to face her. "What would you do if money were no object?" he asked. "If you could choose any path?" Delilah had never been asked such a question before. As a woman, her options had always seemed predetermined: marriage, motherhood, perhaps teaching if she remained unmarried. The idea of choosing her own destiny was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I would stay," she said finally. "I would find a small place of my own, perhaps open a dressmaking shop. My mother taught me to sew, and I've always had a knack for it." Vaughn nodded thoughtfully. "That's a practical ambition. The town could use a good dressmaker, since Mrs. Holloway's eyesight began failing." "But it requires capital I don't have," Delilah sighed. "And while I might eventually find employment as a shopgirl or a teacher's assistant, such positions don't pay enough to establish oneself independently." "There might be another option," Vaughn said carefully. "The Cattlemen's Association is looking for someone to manage their office here in town. Keeping records, handling correspondence, that sort of thing. It pays well better than teaching or clerking." Delilah stared at him in surprise. "And you think they would consider a woman for such a position?" "The man who makes the decision owes me a favor," Vaughn said with a slight smile. "If you're interested, I could put in a word." Hope fluttered in Delilah's chest, fragile but insistent. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Calloway, but why would you do this for me?" In the moonlight, his expression softened. "Because you deserve a choice, Miss Matthews. A real one. Not just the paths others have decided are suitable for you." His words touched something deep within her, a yearning for autonomy she had scarcely acknowledged, even to herself. For a moment, neither spoke, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves above them and the distant hooting of an owl. "Thank you," Delilah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I would be very grateful for your recommendation." Vaughn nodded, seemingly pleased by her acceptance. "I'll speak to Mr. Henderson tomorrow. In the meantime—" He hesitated, then reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. "Please accept this as an advance on your salary." Delilah shook her head immediately. "I couldn't possibly. It's not charity," he interrupted gently. "It's merely practical. You'll need somewhere to stay until your first payment comes through. Consider it a loan if that makes you more comfortable." She wanted to refuse, her pride demanded it, but practicality won out. Without this assistance, she would have no choice but to accept her aunt's invitation, at least temporarily. "A loan, then," she agreed, reluctantly accepting the pouch. "To be repaid in full once I receive my first wages." "As you wish," Vaughn said, though something in his tone suggested he had no intention of collecting the debt. "Now it's getting late. Allow me to escort you home once more." As they walked back toward town, Delilah felt a curious lightness in her chest. For the first time since her family's deaths, the future didn't seem like an empty void. There was a possibility now, however small, that she might forge her own path. And it was all thanks to the most unlikely of benefactors, a cowboy with a dangerous reputation and unexpectedly kind eyes. True to his word, Vaughn spoke to Mr. Henderson the following day. By week's end, Delilah found herself sitting behind a modest desk in the Cattlemen's Association office, learning the filing system from the retiring clerk, an elderly man with rheumy eyes and gnarled hands. The work wasn't difficult, primarily recording cattle sales, maintaining membership ledgers, and handling correspondence, but it required precision and attention to detail, qualities Delilah possessed in abundance. By the end of her first week, Mr. Henderson was already expressing satisfaction with her performance. "Calloway was right about you," the portly rancher said, peering at her over his spectacles. "Quick study, neat hand, and not afraid of numbers. Most women get flustered when faced with the account books." Delilah bit back a retort about his limited experience with most women and simply smiled. "Thank you, sir. I find the work quite interesting, actually." With her new position came a modest but respectable income enough to rent a small room above the milliner's shop and begin setting aside savings for her eventual dressmaking business. The arrangement was temporary, she reminded herself, but it provided the independence she craved. Vaughn Calloway, meanwhile, had disappeared from Sweetwater Creek shortly after securing her position. "Association business," Mr. Henderson explained when she inquired casually about his absence. "Tracking a gang that's been hitting ranches across 3 counties. Could be gone for weeks." Delilah told herself the disappointment she felt was merely gratitude she hadn't been able to express properly. After all, she barely knew the man, regardless of the unexpected connection they'd formed in the church that evening. Yet as days turned to weeks, she found herself watching the road whenever she walked to and from the office, hoping to glimpse his tall figure returning to town. It was nearly a month before her vigilance was rewarded. Delilah was working late one evening, reconciling a particularly complex set of ledgers, when the office door opened. Looking up, expecting to see Mr. Henderson checking on her progress, she instead found Vaughn Calloway standing in the doorway. He looked trail-worn and weary, his clothes dusty from the road, a shadow of beard darkening his jaw. But his eyes brightened when they fell on her, surprise and pleasure evident in his expression. "Miss Matthews," he said, removing his hat. "I didn't expect to find you here at this hour." Delilah set down her pen, suddenly aware of her ink-stained fingers and the loose tendrils of hair that had escaped her normally neat bun. "Mr. Calloway, welcome back to Sweetwater Creek." He stepped fully into the office, closing the door behind him. "Henderson tells me you're proving invaluable. Says the books haven't been this orderly in years." A flush of pride warmed her cheeks. "That's kind of him to say. I've found I enjoy the work more than I anticipated." Vaughn nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It suits you, then?" "Very much so." Delilah hesitated, then added, "I'm grateful for your recommendation, Mr. Calloway. Truly. It's allowed me to remain in Sweetwater Creek on my own terms." "I'm glad to hear it." He moved further into the room, his gaze taking in the neat stacks of papers on her desk, the freshly filled inkwell, the small vase of wildflowers she'd placed on the windowsill to brighten the otherwise austere office. "You've made the place your own," he observed. "Just a few small touches," she replied, suddenly self-conscious. Mr. Henderson didn't object. Nor should he. A pleasant environment encourages productivity, or so I'm told. His tone was light, but Delilah noticed the weariness in his stance, the way he seemed to be favoring his left side slightly. "Are you injured, Mr. Calloway?" she asked, concern overriding propriety. He seemed startled by the question, then rueful. "Nothing serious. A disagreement with one of the rustlers we were tracking. I came to drop off my report before heading to the doctor." "Let me see," Delilah said, rising from her desk before she could reconsider the impropriety of her offer. Vaughn hesitated, clearly surprised by her directness. "It's just a scratch, Miss Matthews. My mother was a healer," she reminded him, her voice firm. "I assisted her with many injuries, including yours once, if I recall correctly. Please sit down." After a moment's consideration, he complied, easing himself into the chair across from her desk with a poorly concealed wince. Delilah moved around to stand beside him, her practiced eye noting the dark stain on his shirt just below his ribs. "You'll need to remove your vest and shirt," she said matter-of-factly. though her heart beat a little faster at the prospect. To his credit, Vaughn didn't protest further. With methodical movements, he unbuttoned his vest and then his shirt, revealing a lean, muscled torso marked by several old scars and one fresh wound, a deep gash about 4 inches long running along his left side. A scratch? Delilah couldn't keep the disapproval from her voice. "This needs stitching, Mr. Calloway." "I've had worse," he replied, though his grimace belied his casual tone. Delilah shook her head in exasperation. "Wait here. I have supplies in my reticule." She fetched her bag from the coat rack, withdrawing a small sewing kit, a vial of alcohol, and a clean handkerchief, items she carried habitually, a habit instilled by her practical mother. Returning to Vaughn's side, she dampened the handkerchief with alcohol. "This will sting," she warned, before carefully cleaning the wound. Vaughn remained stoic, though she felt his muscles tense beneath her touch. The cut was clean, at least, and showed no signs of infection. Still, it would need closing to heal properly. "I'll need to stitch this," she told him, threading a needle with steady hands. "Are you certain you wouldn't prefer the doctor?" "I trust your hands more than Doc Wilson's," Vaughn said quietly. "The man drinks more whiskey than he dispenses." Delilah couldn't argue with that assessment. With careful precision, she began to close the wound, her stitches small and even. Vaughn remained perfectly still throughout the procedure, his breathing controlled and deep. "You've done this before," he observed after a few moments. "Many times," she confirmed, not looking up from her work. "My mother believed everyone should know basic healing, especially women. She said we couldn't always rely on doctors being available or competent." A small chuckle rumbled through Vaughn's chest. A wise woman. She was, Delilah agreed, the familiar pang of loss momentarily distracting her. She paused, taking a steadying breath before continuing with her stitching. They fell silent as she worked, the only sounds the ticking of the office clock and their quiet breathing. Delilah was acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth radiating from his skin, of the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingertips when she pressed the handkerchief to his side. It was the closest she had ever been to a man not related to her, and despite the clinical nature of the situation, she couldn't help but notice the broadness of his shoulders, the defined muscles of his abdomen, the scattering of dark hair on his chest. "There," she said finally, tying off the last stitch and cutting the thread. "It's not my neatest work, but it should hold." "Thank you," Vaughn said, his voice lower than before. When she finally met his gaze, the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "You should keep it clean and dry for at least a week," she instructed, quickly gathering her supplies and stepping away from him. "And try not to engage in any more disagreements with rustlers, if you can help it." Vaughn smiled as he carefully rebut-toned his shirt. "I'll do my best, Miss Matthews. Though in my line of work, such encounters are sometimes unavoidable." "Then perhaps you should consider a different line of work," she suggested, returning to her seat behind the desk. "Perhaps I should," he agreed thoughtfully, surprising her. "A man can't live by the gun forever." Delilah studied him curiously. "What would you do instead?" Vaughn leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "I've been saving to buy land. A small ranch, nothing fancy. Enough space to raise horses." A faint smile touched his lips. "I've always had a way with horses." "That sounds like a fine ambition," Delilah said, trying to imagine this dangerous man in a more settled life. Somehow, the image fit better than she would have expected. "And what of your plans?" he asked. "Henderson mentioned you're saving for a dressmaking shop." Delilah nodded, pleased that he remembered. "Eventually, yes. I need to build my clientele first, which I've begun to do in the evenings. Mrs. Holloway has been kind enough to recommend me to some of her former customers." "I've no doubt you'll succeed," Vaughn said with a certainty that warmed her. "You've a determination about you that's rare." The compliment brought a flush to her cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." He stood then, moving with careful precision to avoid straining his fresh stitches. "I should let you return to your work. And I need to report to Henderson before he retires for the evening." "Of course," Delilah agreed, though she found herself reluctant to see him go. "Thank you again for the opportunity you've given me. I hope to repay your loans soon." Vaughn waved away her words. "There's no hurry on that account. I'm just pleased to see you thriving." He settled his hat on his head, tipping it slightly in her direction. "Good evening, Miss Matthews." "Good evening, Mr. Calloway," she replied, watching as he moved toward the door. Just before he reached it, however, he turned back. "I wonder," he said, a note of uncertainty in his voice that seemed out of character for such a confident man, "if you might permit me to call on you properly sometime. Perhaps this Sunday after church?" The invitation was unexpected, though not unwelcome. Delilah felt her pulse quicken at the prospect. "I would like that, Mr. Calloway." A genuine smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger, less careworn. "Until Sunday, then." After he departed, Delilah sat motionless at her desk, the ledgers forgotten as she replayed their conversation in her mind. Vaughn Calloway had just asked to court her, for that was surely what calling properly implied, and she had accepted, without hesitation. What would the townspeople say? The notorious cowboy and the respectable young clerk? There would be gossip, certainly, raised eyebrows, and whispered conversations. Strangely, Delilah found she didn't care. In Vaughn, she had found someone who saw her as she truly was, not as a pitiable orphan or a proper young lady to be married off, but as a woman with dreams and capabilities of her own. For the first time since that evening in the church, Delilah felt a spark of something beyond mere survival. Something that felt remarkably like hope. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze, perfect weather for the first official calling of Vaughn Calloway on Miss Delilah Matthews. The news had spread quickly through Sweetwater Creek, as news tended to do in small towns, and Delilah was conscious of curious glances during the morning church service. Vaughn attended as well. Something she gathered from the whispers around her was a rare occurrence. He sat at the back, his tall frame conspicuous among the regular congregants, his Sunday best lacking the customary dust and wear of his working clothes. When their eyes met briefly across the crowded church, the small smile he offered made her heart flutter in a most undignified manner. After the service, as people mingled outside in the churchyard, Delilah found herself cornered by Mrs. Prescott, the banker's wife and self-appointed guardian of the town's social propriety. "My dear," the older woman said, her voice lowered but carrying that particular tone that Delilah recognized as prelude to unwanted advice, "I feel I must speak to you about Mr. Calloway." Delilah steeled herself. "What about him, Mrs. Prescott?" "Well, while he may be employed by the association, his reputation is concerning." Her thin lips pursed disapprovingly. "There are stories about his past that would make your hair curl. Violent encounters, unsavory companions. Not the sort of man a respectable young woman should encourage." Before Delilah could formulate a suitably polite yet dismissive response, a deep voice spoke from behind her. "Mrs. Prescott," Vaughn said, his tone pleasant but with an undercurrent of steel, "spreading gossip after church? I'm not sure Reverend Thompson would approve." The woman flushed, her hand fluttering to her throat. "Mr. Calloway, I was merely expressing concern for Miss Matthews' welfare, as any responsible member of the community would do." "How thoughtful," Vaughn replied, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "But I assure you, Miss Matthews is quite capable of making her own judgments about character." Mrs. Prescott sniffed indignantly, but, faced with Vaughn's imposing presence, apparently thought better of continuing her warnings. "Well, I simply felt it my duty to speak up. Good day to you both." As she retreated, Delilah turned to Vaughn with a mixture of amusement and gratitude. "Thank you for the rescue, though I fear you've just confirmed all her worst suspicions about your dangerous nature." His expression softened as he looked down at her. Does that concern you? What people like Mrs. Prescott think? Delilah considered the question seriously. A month ago, perhaps even a week ago, it might have. But something had shifted within her since that night in the church, a recognition that the opinions of others mattered far less than her own judgment, her own happiness. No, she said finally, the certainty in her voice surprising even herself. It doesn't concern me at all. The approval in Vaughn's eyes warmed her more than the Sunday sun. In that case, Miss Matthews, may I have the pleasure of escorting you on a picnic? I've taken the liberty of preparing a basket. Delilah glanced toward where he indicated a fine wicker basket sitting on the seat of a handsome buggy she didn't recognize. You've gone to some trouble, Mr. Calloway. It seemed appropriate for the occasion, he replied, offering his arm. I even borrowed a proper carriage, rather than subjecting you to horseback. The consideration touched her. A picnic sounds lovely. They drove out of town, heading toward a grove of cottonwoods that grew alongside Sweetwater Creek itself. The spot was popular for Sunday outings, public enough to be proper, yet offering pockets of privacy among the trees. Several other buggies were already there when they arrived, families and couples spread out along the grassy banks. Vaughn found them a secluded spot beneath a spreading cottonwood, far enough from the other picnickers for conversation to remain private, but still within sight, a concession to propriety that Delilah appreciated. He spread a blanket with unexpected grace and began unpacking the basket, revealing an impressive array of food. Did you prepare all this yourself? Delilah asked, watching as he arranged cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, and even a jar of preserves. A faint flush colored his tanned cheeks. Mrs. Danvers at the hotel kitchen helped. I'm afraid my own cooking skills are limited to coffee and beans over a campfire. The admission made him seem more human, less the dangerous figure of town legend. Delilah smiled as she accepted the plate he offered her. An honest assessment. I appreciate that. They ate in companionable conversation, discovering shared interests and differences of opinion. Vaughn, it turned out, had a surprising knowledge of literature, having spent long cattle drives with books borrowed from a former schoolteacher turned rancher. Most cowboys play cards or drink when the day's done, he explained, but reading seemed a better use of time. Though I'll admit, my choices were limited to whatever Jenkins had in his saddlebags. A lot of Shakespeare and Greek philosophy. Hence your ability to quote Socrates earlier, Delilah said, recalling his reference during a discussion about the town council's decision-making. Vaughn looked pleased that she'd noticed. Most people assume I'm uneducated because of my profession. A dangerous assumption, Delilah replied. Underestimating others is rarely wise. A lesson I've learned repeatedly, he agreed, his expression turning more serious. People are seldom what they first appear to be. Like a notorious cowboy with a fondness for philosophy, she suggested with a smile. Or a proper young lady who stitches wounds without flinching and stands her ground against town gossips, he countered, his gaze warm as it rested on her face. The afternoon passed quickly, the conversation flowing easily between them. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the creek, other picnickers packed up and departed. Soon, they were nearly alone in the grove. We should head back soon, Delilah said reluctantly, aware of the propriety of returning before dusk. Vaughn nodded, though he seemed equally reluctant to end their time together. May I ask you something first, Miss Matthews? Of course. He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. Why did you accept my invitation? After everything you must have heard about me. Delilah considered her answer carefully. I judge people by their actions, Mr. Calloway, not by hearsay. You showed me kindness when I needed it most, expecting nothing in return. That tells me more about your character than any gossip ever could. Vaughn's expression softened, something vulnerable showing briefly in his eyes before he masked it. I'm not the man they say I am, he said quietly. But I'm not entirely innocent of all they whisper either. My past has shadows. Everyone's does, Delilah replied. What matters is the direction we choose moving forward. He studied her face, as if searching for doubt or judgment. Finding none, he nodded slowly. You're a remarkable woman, Delilah Matthews. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it sent a pleasant shiver through her. And you, Vaughn Calloway, are not nearly as frightening as you'd like people to believe. His laugh was unexpected and genuine, breaking the tension of the moment. Don't tell anyone. It would ruin my reputation entirely. As they packed up the picnic and drove back toward town, Delilah found herself contemplating the curious path her life had taken. 2 months ago, she had been crying alone in a church, believing her future held nothing but grief and obligation. Now, sitting beside a man who challenged every preconception she'd held about him, she felt something she had almost forgotten: anticipation for what tomorrow might bring. The weeks that followed established a pattern to their courtship. Vaughn called regularly when in town, escorting Delilah to church socials, occasional dinners at the hotel restaurant, and Sunday picnics that became a tradition between them. When his work took him away, which it still did with frustrating frequency, he sent telegrams or brief letters, sometimes accompanied by small tokens: a ribbon from a distant town, a pressed wildflower from the prairie, once even a slender volume of poetry he'd found in a bookshop in Fort Worth. To Delilah's surprise, the town's initial scandalized reaction to their association gradually softened. Vaughn's behavior was impeccably proper in public, his obvious respect for her winning over even some of the more skeptical matrons. The fact that he now attended church regularly and had cut back significantly on his time at the Broken Spoke didn't hurt matters. You're reforming, Delilah teased him one evening as they walked slowly back to her lodgings after a town meeting. Soon you'll be considered completely respectable. Vaughn groaned dramatically. A fate worse than death. Next thing you know, they'll ask me to join the town council. The horror. She agreed with mock solemnity, though privately, she thought he would make an excellent councilman. His practical nature and direct approach to problems would be refreshing among the often circular discussions of the current membership. As they reached the steps to the milliner's shop, Vaughn hesitated. These moments at the end of their outings had gradually grown longer, neither quite willing to part. Tonight, he seemed particularly reluctant. I've received word from the association, he said finally. There's trouble brewing north of here. Cattle theft on a large scale, possibly organized by the same gang we've been tracking. They want me to investigate. Delilah felt her heart sink, though she kept her expression neutral. How long will you be gone? That's just it, he replied, turning to face her fully. I'm considering turning down the assignment. This surprised her. But why? It's your job. Vaughn ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of inner conflict. I've been thinking about what we discussed. About not living by the gun forever. He paused, then added more quietly, about that piece of land I mentioned. Understanding dawned. You're thinking of buying your ranch? He nodded. There's a property available just outside of town. Nothing fancy, a small house, good pasture, access to water. The owner's moving to California and eager to sell. That sounds perfect for you, Delilah said sincerely, trying to ignore the flutter of excitement at the thought of Vaughn settling permanently in Sweetwater Creek. I think it could be, he agreed, his eyes holding hers intently. But before I make any decisions, I need to know something. Delilah's pulse quickened at his tone. What's that? Vaughn took a deep breath, then reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his. If I were to stay, to build a life here, would you consider sharing it with me? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Delilah stared up at him, momentarily speechless. They had never explicitly discussed marriage, though their courtship had certainly been heading in that direction. Still, to hear the question asked so directly. Are you proposing, Mr. Calloway? She asked when she found her voice, her tone lighter than she felt. A smile tugged at his mouth. Not formally.
Not yet.
I wouldn't insult you with a proposal before I have something solid to offer. But I am asking if it's a possibility worth working toward. The honesty of his approach touched her deeply. How like Vaughn to be so straightforward, to seek certainty before committing to a path. Yes, Delilah said simply, squeezing his hand. It's definitely a possibility worth working toward. The relief and joy that transformed his face made her heart swell. For a long moment, they stood there, hands linked, the unspoken promise between them more binding than any formal engagement could be. Finally, reluctantly, Vaughn released her hand. In that case, I believe I'll inform Mr. Henderson tomorrow that my services are no longer available for extended assignments. He won't be pleased, Delilah pointed out. He'll survive, Vaughn replied with a grin. Besides, I won't be leaving the association entirely, just limiting my work to the local area. As she watched him walk away, his stride purposeful and his shoulders straight, Delilah felt a curious sense of rightness settle over her. This wasn't the future she had imagined for herself, not even close, but somehow it felt more true, more authentic than any path that had been laid out for her before. The following months brought change at a pace that sometimes left Delilah breathless. True to his word, Vaughn purchased the ranch property and began the work of turning it into a viable horse breeding operation. He continued working part-time for the association, but only on cases that kept him close to Sweetwater Creek. Meanwhile, Delilah's position at the office had evolved. Mr. Henderson, recognizing her aptitude for organization and numbers, had increased her responsibilities and her salary accordingly. In the evenings, her dressmaking business continued to grow, with orders now coming from neighboring towns as word of her skills spread. Their courtship progressed steadily, their understanding of each other deepening with each passing week. Vaughn was a man of contrasts. Delilah discovered capable of cold precision when tracking criminals, yet gentle with injured animals, intimidating to those who crossed him, yet patient with children who approached him wide-eyed in town, drawn by his reputation and impressive height. He spoke little of his past, though occasionally he would share fragments. A childhood spent on a failing farm in East Texas, the father who taught him to track and hunt, the years after his father's death when he had ridden with men whose morals were as flexible as their loyalty. Delilah never pressed for more than he offered freely, understanding that some memories were better left undisturbed. For her part, Delilah found herself growing more confident, more willing to speak her mind not only with Vaughn but in other aspects of her life as well. When Mr. Henderson balked at her suggestion to modernize the association's filing system, she presented such a compelling case that he not only acquiesced but later praised her initiative to the board members. As summer turned to fall, the ranch house slowly transformed under Vaughn's hands. He was surprisingly skilled at carpentry, another talent acquired during his varied past, and spent his free time making repairs and improvements. Delilah often joined him on weekends, bringing picnic lunches and offering opinions on everything from paint colors to furniture placement. "You have strong views for someone who doesn't live here," Vaughn teased one Saturday as they debated the merits of different stoves for the kitchen. Delilah raised an eyebrow. "Are you implying my input isn't welcome, Mr. Calloway?" His expression softened as he looked at her, standing amid the half-finished kitchen with flour on her cheek from the bread she'd been kneading. "On the contrary, Miss Matthews, I'm hoping you'll have very strong opinions about this house for many years to come." The implication was clear, and Delilah felt her cheeks warm. "In that case, we should definitely choose the larger stove. A family needs proper cooking space." The word family hung between them, filled with promise and possibility. Vaughn's eyes darkened as he stepped closer, his hand rising to gently brush the flour from her cheek. "Delilah," he said softly, "I think it's time I asked you properly." Her heart stuttered in her chest.
"Now?"
"Here? I'm covered in flour, and you've sawdust in your hair." A smile curved his mouth. I can't think of a more perfect moment. This is who we are, building something together, making something out of nothing. He took her flour-dusted hands in his calloused ones. Will you marry me? Not because you need protection or security, but because we're better together than apart. Tears pricked at Delilah's eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming rightness of the moment. This wasn't a proposal born of social expectation or practical necessity, but of genuine love and partnership. Yes, she said, her voice clear and certain. Yes, I will marry you, Vaughn Calloway. His kiss was gentle at first, then deeper, more insistent, communicating all the emotion words couldn't capture. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. I don't have a ring yet, he admitted. I wanted to be sure of your answer first. Delilah laughed softly. Always practical. I do have something, though, he said, reaching into his pocket. It's not much, but... He withdrew a small object and placed it in her palm, a carved wooden heart, sanded smooth and polished to a soft glow. The workmanship was exquisite, each curve perfectly formed. Did you make this? Delilah asked, turning it over in her hand. Vaughn nodded, a hint of uncertainty in his expression. My father taught me. It's a tradition in my family. The men carve a heart for the woman they intend to marry. The sentiment behind the simple gift moved her deeply. It's beautiful, Vaughn. I'll treasure it always. Relief and happiness mingled in his smile. We can choose a proper ring in town next week, if you like. There's no hurry, Delilah assured him, closing her fingers around the wooden heart. This means more to me than any diamond could. They were married on a crisp October morning, with the cottonwoods along Sweetwater Creek turning gold against the clear blue sky. The church that had once witnessed Delilah's deepest grief now echoed with joy as she walked down the aisle to where Vaughn waited, tall and solemn in a new suit, his expression transforming as she approached. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, attended by most of the town, including, to Delilah's amusement, Mrs. Prescott, who had eventually revised her opinion of Vaughn after he single-handedly drove off a group of troublemakers threatening the town's bank. I still think he's dangerous, the older woman had confided to Delilah at the engagement announcement, but perhaps that's not entirely a bad quality in a husband these days. After the wedding breakfast at the hotel, the newlyweds departed for their ranch, now fully renovated and ready for habitation. As Vaughn lifted her down from the buggy, Delilah was struck by how far they had both come from that evening in the empty church. Happy? Vaughn asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Delilah smiled up at him, her heart full. More than I ever thought possible. He kissed her then, under the golden leaves of the oak tree he had planted near the house, a kiss that held the promise of all the days to come, of the life they would build together on this piece of land that was now truly their home. That evening, as twilight settled over the prairie, they sat together on the porch swing Vaughn had built, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. His arm was warm around her shoulders, her head fitting perfectly against his chest. Do you remember what you said to me that night in the church? Vaughn asked quietly. About hearing your family sometimes, expecting to find them still there? Delilah nodded, surprised he recalled that particular confession. Yes. I've been thinking about that, he continued, his voice low and thoughtful. About how the people we love never really leave us. They become part of who we are, shaping us even in their absence. She glanced up at him, touched by the unexpected philosophy. That's a beautiful way to think of it. Vaughn's arm tightened slightly around her. Your family would be proud of you, Delilah. Of your strength, your determination. Of the life you've made for yourself. Tears pricked at her eyes, but they weren't the desperate tears she had shed in the church all those months ago. These were gentler, touched with gratitude rather than grief. Thank you, she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. For saying that. For being there that night. For everything that followed. He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I'm the one who should be thanking you. You gave me a reason to stop drifting, to put down roots, to become the man I always wanted to be, but wasn't sure I could be." In the gathering darkness, with the sounds of the prairie night rising around them, Delilah felt a sense of completion, of coming full circle. The journey that had begun in sorrow had led her here, to this man, this place, this moment of perfect contentment. "I love you, Vaughn Calloway," she said softly. His smile was visible even in the dim light, transforming his face from its habitual seriousness to something younger, almost boyish. "And I love you, Delilah Calloway, more than I ever thought possible." As the stars continued to emerge above them, Delilah settled back against her husband's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures in their shared life. But for now, this moment was enough, this quiet culmination of a journey neither of them could have anticipated, when a grieving woman and a solitary cowboy crossed paths in an empty church as the sun began to rise. The years that followed brought changes both expected and surprising to the Calloway ranch. Within a year of their marriage, Delilah gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, after Vaughn's mother. 2 years later, a son joined their family, James, named for Delilah's father. The horse breeding business thrived under Vaughn's careful management. His eye for quality stock and fair dealing earned him a reputation that spread throughout the territory, bringing buyers from as far away as Kansas City and Denver. Meanwhile, Delilah's dressmaking enterprise had grown enough to warrant a small shop in town, which she managed 2 days a week while a capable young assistant handled the remainder. Sweetwater Creek itself was changing too, growing from a dusty frontier town into a respectable community with a proper school, additional businesses, and even a small library, the latter a project Delilah had spearheaded with surprising support from the town council, which now included Vaughn among its members. Who would have thought, Delilah teased him after one particularly contentious council meeting, that the dangerous cowboy would become a pillar of the community? Vaughn had simply laughed, shaking his head at the irony. Life takes unexpected turns. None more unexpected, perhaps, than the evening 5 years into their marriage, when a stranger arrived at their ranch just as dusk was falling. Delilah was in the kitchen, preparing supper while the children played in the adjoining room, when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Through the window, she watched as Vaughn, who had been mending tack on the porch, set aside his work and rose to meet the visitor, a tall, lean man whose face was obscured by the brim of his hat. Something about Vaughn's posture, suddenly alert and wary, sent a shiver of apprehension through her. Setting down the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables, Delilah moved to the doorway, her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in the yard. The stranger dismounted slowly, deliberately, his movements suggesting caution rather than threat. As he stepped into the pool of light from the house, he removed his hat, revealing a face that bore a startling resemblance to her husband's, the same strong jawline, the same shape to the eyes, though this man's hair was streaked with gray and his face more weathered. "Hello, little brother," the stranger said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "It's been a long time." Delilah watched as shock registered on Vaughn's face, followed by a complex series of emotions too rapid to identify. She knew, from the fragments he'd shared of his past, that he had an older brother who had left home before their father died, who had chosen a path that diverged sharply from anything respectable. A brother he hadn't seen or heard from in nearly 15 years. "Daniel," Vaughn said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "What brings you here?" The older Calloway glanced toward the house, his gaze landing briefly on Delilah in the doorway before returning to his brother. "Can a man visit his only family without an interrogation?" "Most men, yes," Vaughn replied evenly. "You?" "I'm not so sure." A tension hung in the air between the brothers, laden with unspoken history. Delilah hesitated only a moment before stepping fully onto the porch, her decision made. Whatever this man's past, whatever his reasons for appearing now, he was Vaughn's blood and, by extension, connected to her children. "You must be hungry after your journey, Mr. Calloway," she called, moving to stand beside her husband. "Supper will be ready shortly. You're welcome to join us." Both men looked at her with similar expressions of surprise, Daniel with raised eyebrows, Vaughn with a questioning glance that she answered with a small, reassuring nod. This was their home, their life together. They were strong enough to face whatever complications Daniel's arrival might bring. After a moment's hesitation, Vaughn stepped back, gesturing toward the house. "You heard my wife. Come inside, Daniel. We can talk after we eat." That night marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Calloway family. Daniel, it emerged over the course of the evening, had indeed lived a life outside the law for many years, riding with various gangs, spending time in prison, drifting from territory to territory, always one step ahead of his reputation. "But I'm getting too old for that life," he admitted as they sat around the kitchen table, the children long since put to bed. Started thinking about what Pa would say if he could see what became of his sons. One a respectable rancher with a family, the other. He trailed off, shaking his head. "What changed?" Vaughn asked, his initial wariness softened, but not entirely gone. Daniel's weathered face grew solemn. "Nearly died last winter. Bullet wound got infected, and I holed up in an abandoned cabin during a blizzard. Figured that was the end of the road for me." He glanced between Vaughn and Delilah. "Makes a man think, facing death alone like that. About choices. Regrets." Delilah watched her husband's expression as he absorbed his brother's words. She knew Vaughn well enough by now to read the conflict in his eyes, the instinctive caution born of years dealing with men whose words rarely matched their intentions, warring with the natural desire to believe in family, in the possibility of redemption. "What are you looking for here, Daniel?" Vaughn finally asked. "If it's money, it's not," his brother interrupted firmly. "I've got enough saved to get by. What I need is a fresh start. Somewhere I can put down roots, use the skills I have that don't involve breaking the law." He hesitated, then added, "I heard about your horse business. Thought maybe you could use an extra hand." The request hung in the air between them, weighted with implication. This wasn't just about a job, it was about second chances, about family reconnecting, about trust that had been broken and might, perhaps, be rebuilt. Delilah reached under the table to squeeze her husband's hand, offering silent support whatever his decision might be. To her surprise, Vaughn's expression cleared, a certainty replacing the earlier conflict. "The old bunkhouse needs fixing up," he said after a moment. "You can stay there for now. As for work, we'll start slow. See how it goes." Relief washed over Daniel's face, making him look suddenly younger. "That's more than fair, brother. More than I expected." Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Delilah watched her husband's face in the mirror as he removed his shirt. "You're sure about this?" she asked quietly. "Giving him a chance?" Vaughn met her eyes in the reflection. "Someone once gave me a chance when others might not have. Sat with me in a church until the sun rose, saw something in me worth believing in." Warmth bloomed in Delilah's chest at the memory. "That was different, was it?" He turned to face her directly. "We all need someone to believe we can be better than our worst choices." Vaughn drew her into his arms, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Besides, the children should know their uncle. Family is too precious to throw away without at least trying." As Delilah nestled against her husband's chest, she reflected on the strange, winding path that had led them here, from that night of deepest grief in the church to this moment of expanded family, of new beginnings not just for them but now for Daniel as well. "You're a good man, Vaughn Calloway," she murmured against his skin. His arms tightened around her. "Only because you helped me become one." To everyone's surprise, perhaps most of all his own, Daniel Calloway thrived in his new life at the ranch. The skills that had made him successful in his outlaw days, horsemanship, quick thinking, and ability to read people, proved valuable in legitimate business as well. Within 6 months, he had become an essential part of the operation, particularly skilled at evaluating horses and negotiating sales. The children adored their uncle, who entertained them with heavily edited stories of his travels and taught them to whittle small animals from scraps of wood. Margaret, now 6, was especially attached to him, following him around the ranch whenever she could escape her chores or lessons. "She has good instincts about people," Vaughn remarked one evening as they watched Daniel patiently showing their daughter how to brush down a gentle mare. "Better than mine were at that age." "She has your eyes, though," Delilah replied, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "The way you both look at someone as if you can see right through to their soul." Vaughn chuckled. "Let's hope she uses that power more wisely than I did in my younger days." As the seasons passed, the Calloway ranch prospered and expanded. They purchased additional land, built a larger stable, hired more hands. Delilah's dress shop became the finest in the county, with orders coming from as far away as San Antonio. Their children grew healthy and strong, their family bonds deepened, and the shadows of the past receded further with each passing year. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Vaughn surprised Delilah with a special gift, a small wooden box he had crafted himself, inlaid with a pattern of hearts similar to the one he had given her when he proposed. "Open it," he urged as they sat together on the porch swing that had become their favorite spot for quiet evenings. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay her mother's locket, the same one she had been clutching that night in the church, now polished to a high shine and hanging from a new gold chain. "I had it repaired in Fort Worth," Vaughn explained as she lifted it out, tears gathering in her eyes. The hinge was broken, and the chain was beyond saving. Delilah carefully opened the locket to find the original tiny photographs of her parents still in place, but on the opposite side, a new edition, a miniature portrait of Vaughn and herself, painted by a traveling artist who had visited Sweetwater Creek the previous summer. "It seemed right," Vaughn said softly, watching her face. The past and the present together. Emotion closed Delilah's throat as she looked from the locket to her husband's face, seeing in it all the love and security she had found in his arms over the years. "It's perfect," she managed finally. "Absolutely perfect." He fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers gentle against her skin. 10 years, he mused. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday we were sitting in that church, and sometimes it feels like I've loved you my entire life." "Both can be true," Delilah replied, touching the locket where it rested against her collarbone. "Time is strange that way." Vaughn drew her close, his arms solid and warm around her shoulders. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if I hadn't come into the church that evening? If I'd ridden out of town the next morning like I'd planned?" Delilah considered this, trying to imagine a life different from the one they had built together. "I suppose I would have gone to St. Louis eventually. Married someone respectable and proper. Led a perfectly acceptable life." "And been happy?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice even after all these years. She turned to face him fully, her hand rising to cup his cheek. "Content, perhaps. But not happy. Not like this." She gestured to encompass their home, their life, the family they had created together. "Never like this." The kiss they shared was tender, filled with the deep understanding that comes from years of partnership, of facing challenges and celebrating joy side by side. When they parted, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers, his voice low and fervent. "I thank God every day that I walked into that church," he murmured. "That I found the courage to sit beside you. That you saw something in me worth believing in." Delilah smiled, her heart full to overflowing with love for this man who had transformed her life in ways she could never have imagined on that grief-stricken night. "And I thank God," she whispered back, "that you stayed until the sun rose." As twilight deepened around them, turning the familiar landscape of their ranch into a tapestry of shadows and silhouettes. They remained on the porch swing, wrapped in each other's arms. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge of being deeply loved. In the bunkhouse, Daniel and the ranch hands played cards and shared stories, creating their own kind of family. And in the hearts of Vaughn and Delilah Calloway, the memory of a night that had seemed the end of all hope but had instead become the beginning of something beautiful would forever remain a testament to the healing power of love, to the unexpected grace that can be found even in our darkest moments, and to the infinite possibilities that dawn when someone cares enough to sit with us until the sun rises.